Hi my lovelies, welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. If you like crime and you like consistency, this is the channel for you. I release on a Wednesday and Sunday night at 7 p.m. So if you haven't subscribed, then why not? Please do that immediately. Also, I want to celebrate tonight because I have a YouTube sponsor, Alibi channel. Can you believe it? Alibi channel has sponsored this YouTube video. And the reason why, if that wasn't good enough, is because there is an incredible new series out. It starts this coming Tuesday, 17th of August at 9 p.m. Obviously, if you're watching this at a later date, go and catch it up because it's absolutely incredible. If some of you are Radio 4 drama buffs, you've probably heard of it because it's based on a hugely successful Annika Strandhed. Now, aside from it being completely unique, and the reason that this is unique is because unlike in most crime dramas where you're an observer, you very much feel part of it because Annika Strandhed, the DI who plays the main role, talks to you throughout it. So she breaks the fourth wall. She makes you part of the conversation. So when you are watching, you are actually hearing her internal thought processes. You're also hearing her high gallows humour. There is a lot of gallows humour, whilst solving very, very important homicide cases. The lead actress is played by the one, the only, and let's be honest, the utterly incredible Nicola Walker. I know you guys, you already know who she is, but she starred in things like Spooks, The Split, and The Incredible Unforgotten, where she played DCI Cassie Stewart. She is unreal. You won't be surprised that she's won Olivier Awards and she's been thrown up for BAFTAs regularly. But what makes this series so unique is they've managed to bring you into it like you feel that you're part of the episode, and the backdrop's unreal. So it's filmed in Scotland, and I love Scotland. It's got incredible atmospheric scenery, the lakes, the views are stunning, but there is a bit of an eeriness sometimes, isn't it? A bit like in Manchester where I live, on a rainy day. It does feel a little bit mysterious. And that's what's so incredible about this series. They've managed to almost connect the scenery with the experiences that are occurring day to day. Now, what blows my mind as well is she is so good at allowing you to feel the connection that she has with the relationships around her, both the fractious ones and also the one that she has with her daughter. Because one of the things that happens in this series is that she's had to move to a new job and it's meant an upheaval. And that means that her teenager, you all know what they're like, has had to go to a completely new school. So you're also getting introduced to just how hard it is to be a working single parent. I want you to watch this immediately, the moment you get an opportunity. I'm gonna obviously show you a little bit about it now. I'm just gonna tempt you, give you a little bit of a teaser. You need an alibi.
Solving a murder can be a slippery business. You might say there's more beneath the surface than meets the eye. Things are not always as they appear. People not always as they seem. And answers can elude you. But as with all the best stories, tension is clearly important. Just not too much.
A new original drama with a new original perspective.
Call me Annika.
So now you've seen that trailer, I want you to watch it on Tuesday, the 17th of August, 9 p.m, and get back to me about it. Also, invite a mate round. We all know it's far better to watch crime with a friend so you can be scared together. And finally, tell me, is Nicola one of the most iconic actresses of our time? The answer is yes, by the way. So just remember that. Okay, let's get on with tonight's True Crime with Emma Kenny. Today's case. Okay, some of you might not agree with me on this, I'm going to put that out there because, first of all, I want you to understand that it's completely acceptable for you to completely disagree with my point of view. And secondly, if you do disagree with that point of view, that your comments are very welcome. I am not Yoda, and I am certainly not justice. I just am an individual who has particular belief systems. And when I study cases, there are certain biases that arguably are part of my makeup. When I talk about abuse and children being brought up in abusive households, because of my work with those children and young people for a very long time, I live and I see the impact that it has on children and on their developing brains and on the attitudes that they have to the world around them. I'm setting up this case because some of you might find me talking about parricide, which is the killing of one's father usually, or sometimes unusually mother, but in this case, both parents, is obviously a crime that we would associate with being heinous and wrong. I obviously understand that that is the case. To take a life is heinous and wrong. But I don't think that it's fair to ever look at things in just black and white. We only learn and grow and develop when we seek to understand the grey area. And in this case, there is a very, very big grey area. So no matter your feelings, whether you've heard about this crime before, whether you think that Jacob Ind is a serious killer who deserves to spend his life behind bars forever, I just want you to stay with me on this and just hear my point of view. You might not change your mind, but nonetheless, I hope you're willing to go on that journey with me. I've spent a lot of time researching, but what I've also done is I've spent a lot of time listening to Jacob. I've spent a lot of time listening to people who know Jacob, because by doing that, I feel I can understand the distinction between the young man who carried out these killings and the grown man that he's become. And I suppose the question for you all at this moment is, do you believe that it's possible for young people to change? Do you believe that a 15-year-old is going to be the same person at 30? You may, but like I said, just go with me on this journey. I suppose it begins when 15-year-old Jacob Ind tells his friends at school that he's killed his parents. And now he also says, in light of what he's done, he's going to kill himself. Now, you would understand that most of his mates are thinking, course you have, Jacob. You've only gone and done your parents in. And most of them don't take him seriously. He isn't a kid who's ever stood out. Jacob Ind is a please and a thank you, sir kind of child. His behaviour is good. He's quiet. He's well behaved. He's considerate. So if you put yourself in that context and suddenly your friend's like, by the way, I've just killed my parents, very few will be like, this is seriously something that will have happened. But there is something about the way he tells his story that unnerves some of his friends. And some of his friends go and they speak to the principal about it. And I'll be honest, the main reason they go and speak to the principal isn't because he said that he's killed his parents. It's that they have a conscious fear that Jacob Ind might be planning his own suicide. So they really go to speak to the principal because they fear for him. Obviously, at this moment in point, the principal has a safeguarding duty, and rightly so. In the UK, we have safeguarding law, and that means that you breach confidentiality, even in practice like I do, if somebody suggests that they have harmed other people, may harm other people, and at times even if they may be a harm to themselves. So whether it's happened or otherwise, the principal will have an obligation immediately to inform the police, because a minor has admitted to potentially doing something very, very wrong, and secondly, that they might be a risk to themselves. So of course, the police go to look at his house and to see whether this is just somebody making things up, or whether indeed it is somebody who's carried out the brutal slaying of his parents. And it doesn't take long before they arrest Jacob Ind and his accomplice. Now, what began in this case, in my opinion, was one of the biggest news stories because it arrived in collaboration at a time with when there were a lot of problems with young people killing other young people. So basically, when Jacob Ind killed his parents, there happens to be almost a summer of killing. The local community is very aware that, in their opinion, children and young people are becoming problematic. They are losing sight of the rules and regulations that creates a moral community. So there is a lot of pressure around, both on the state and the jurisdiction of the police and within the press, to ensure that children and young people who kill are treated in a very severe way. And I'll be honest with you, this particular case, it was one of the biggest cases in US history. The police were called to his home and Jacob Ind's parents were found dead. That's his mother Pamela and stepfather Kermit Jordan. Within that, they found absolute carnage. They found both Pamela and Kermit dead. He was kind of known as Kermit, by the way, but I'll refer to him as Kermode from now on, but you will hear him referred to it as Kermit in reports. It's also clear from the scene, because it is a really devastating scene, that there's been a struggle. And the police officers who were involved with it said that when they turned up, it was one of the most brutal scenes that they'd ever seen. It was one of the most brutal murders they'd ever seen. Again, I want to draw your attention to the fact that murder isn't common, and murder in this area wasn't common. So when homicide detectives come and see a scene, they are basing their parameters of experience on the amount that they've been involved in. Parricide is very unusual indeed, and that stains somebody's conscience. So when you go and see somebody who's been killed in a gangbang, you maybe aren't seeing it in the same context as when you see, as far as you're concerned, two innocent middle-class people who seem to have been slain in their own home by their own son. But nonetheless, their perspective was it was one of the most brutal slayings that they'd ever heard. When we look at the Ind family, one of the things that seems to stand out as well is this is a very middle-class, well-to-do family. They live in a beautiful family home. In fact, neighbours would say that they'd often drive past the home and imagine who lives there. It was so perfect. They seemed to embody the perfect American family dream. They lived in this home at Woodland Park, Colorado. It's upmarket, incredibly quiet. And I suppose one of those places that to some degree still lived a little bit in the past. People left their doors unlocked, for example. So it wasn't a concerned area. You weren't worried about crime. And so this means that the police, the press, and even the justice system in that area would be rocked by this kind of crime. It just wasn't the kind of thing that happened in this area. And that, with respect, creates a bias because people imagine that they are safe. And then suddenly when something so profoundly unusual and out of character occurs in an area, it makes people feel that they are vulnerable. And when we are vulnerable, we act from fear and not necessarily always from logic. When people talked to Jacob Ind's school, one of the people who came forward was his counsellor, that's David Greathouse. He was really, really concerned about Jacob's ideas around wanting to harm his parents. So Jacob Ind had actually talked to him about the fact that he'd thought about hurting his parents. And he'd actually arranged for Jacob Ind to see a mental health specialist, but what Jacob said was everything was fine. Everything wasn't fine. And there's a lot of reasons just to say why everything wasn't fine. And I want you to understand that I have worked with children and young people who have been raped by a parent in the morning and gone to school in the day and seemed fine. And when nurses in the school or counsellors in the school or teachers in the school have maybe seen signs of self-harm, and they've brought the child in, the child again has said that they are fine. Children don't tell you about their fears and secrets. It's not linear. This idea that a child will just come forth with the truth about their life is not something that is commonplace. In fact, the reason that we know it's not commonplace is because millions and millions of people deal with sexual abuse, neglect and harm constantly. And it can be decades, almost lifetimes sometimes, before they actually tell the truth about the horrors that were inflicted on them at home. The level of shame that children feel when the very people that they believe are meant to love and protect them harm them renders so many silent. And I want you to hear that, because Jacob Ind's case is one that I feel needs the diligence and duty of compassion when exploring the facts that are indeed horrifically brutal. Now, when he spoke to the individual about his mental health and said that everything was fine, he kind of passed it off that on the 17th of December 1992, which is the night he killed his parents, that he hadn't got a lot of sleep. So he put it down to that. He was creating excuses. But the reality was, the reason he hadn't got a lot of sleep was because he'd killed his parents, his mother and his stepfather. He'd also recruited a friend of his, Gabriel Adams. He wanted him to help him carry out the deed. In fact, with respect, he asked Gabriel to kill his parents for him. The truth is, this all began when a friend of Jacob was present in his house when his mother was really abusive towards him. And after his friend had watched the abuse unfurl, he said he wouldn't put up with it. He'd kill his parents if they treated him that way. This is when Jacob was 13 years of age, and he said, obviously in that moment, that wasn't something that he planned, but it stuck. There was a sense that thought stuck with him, and he would play it over and over. And whenever he was having difficulties in his home, he would imagine that one day it would come to an end, and he would play with that fantasy. Now, that isn't unusual. I'm sure a lot of us can look back at moments in time where we might have been bullied or abused or harmed, and we may have harboured these dark fantasies about what we would do if we could just get away with it. Certainly I would. Honestly, this is my God's honest truth. I'm glad we don't have guns in the UK, because I'm pretty sure that at times, definitely when I was younger, I might have shot a few people. It sounds ridiculous to say, doesn't it? But I can remember moments of incredible rage. I can remember moments of feeling completely out of control, and I'm not sure whether I would have been able to maintain a manager as a kid. As an adult, of course. As an adult, I can see that my conscience would be like, you do not shoot people. But what I'm trying to say is, in the heat of the moment when I was a child, I don't know what I could have done. I got in fights. So if I got in physical fights, it's only one step further, isn't it? And Jacob Ind held on to this idea, this fantasy. And one of the reasons they got Gabriel Adams to help him was because Gabriel was really developmentally slow. He had a very low IQ. He had quite severe mental health issues. He'd go to school dressed fully in army gear. He'd even want to be called Major by his friends. This was not a young man who managed his mental health effectively, and it's not a man who was very well balanced. He was a child who was a struggling child. He was also very much known as a loner. And the fact that he turned up to school in army surplus uniforms and insisted on being called Major and suggested he was a martial arts expert at 17 does kind of show you that this kid is not living in the real world. An old teacher would actually say that one of the things that he did in the local community was he was known for torturing and killing small animals. So we have problems, right? We have a young person who's definitely showing issues around conduct disorder, for example, maybe oppositional disorder, but also he clearly is in some kind of pain because he's living in a fantasy world, dressing up and doing all these strange things. And the fact that he's torturing and killing animals is deeply disturbing. You all know children who kill and torture animals can often go on, if they are looked at as a psychopath, to have found that kind of behaviours in the past present in their childhoods. So we have a marker there, don't we? Jacob Ind is aware that there is some strangeness about Gabriel Adams. So he says to him, I will pay you $2,000 to kill my parents. Jacob Ind didn't even have that money. He just wanted his parents gone. And one of the things that he made very clear was he wanted no part of it. He didn't want to have any involvement in the actual killing. He didn't have bloodlust. It wasn't a situation where he wanted to go and repeatedly knife or shoot them. You know, he wanted them out of the way, but he didn't really want to be a part of it. He wanted it to look like a random killing. Some sophistication to that thought process. But one of the things that you'll know if you watch some of the videos of Jacob Ind is he's a bright man. He's an intelligent man. So even as a young man, he can kind of see that if he wants to get away with murder, if he wants to get away with this situation, then if he can make it look like a house invasion where somebody has murdered his parents and he's luckily survived, that's his best chance. The problem is the killing just doesn't go according to plan at all. And Gabriel Adams makes a huge mess of it. One of the reasons that he makes a huge mess of it is he uses a .22 caliber gun that really doesn't have the impact that's required to kill people instantly. So Gabriel Adams comes into the house, sneaks into Pamela and Kermit's bedroom, and then initially he shoots Kermit in the head. Then he shoots Pamela. And he doesn't kill him. In fact, they wake up. Just think about that. So they've been shot. This kid who doesn't really know very much, this apparent martial arts expert who's agreed to go and bump people off for $2,000. He's thinking that they're going to be dead straight away. Can you see that childlike quality? Can you see that even though this young man is clearly psychopathic in his actions, there is also an immaturity to it? He imagines that if you just shoot people through the head, they're going to die. And it doesn't work unless you're using a particular type of gun and it goes in a particular type of entry through the brain. So he isn't expecting that anything's going to occur apart from they're going to stay asleep. So then he uses a hunting knife and they struggle. And what happens is Jacob Ind wakes up to this screaming. This screaming. This is a boy who just wants everything to go away. He goes into the room, he sees the chaos. And obviously at this point, Gabriel Adams is going because it's all gone horribly wrong. And as I've always taught you on these videos, the problem with human beings is they are unpredictable. You think that you can plan a murder, you think that you can plan a scene, but it doesn't play out that way because human beings do things like wake up and fight. Jacob Ind knows that this has gone horribly wrong and he doesn't know what to do. He goes into his room, he gets some bear mace because bears are in the area, so he has this very strong bear mace, very painful stuff to get in your eyes. Obviously, it's a deterrent. And he goes in and he sprays his parents in the face with it. I don't think at that moment in time he's thinking very much. He just wants it to be over. He must have known it wouldn't kill them. But maybe his fear is that they're going to overpower him and he's got to create a situation where they're not able to fight, where they're rendered unable because they're dealing with the pain of the mace. He then goes to the bathroom where Kermit actually keeps his gun. And he's got a Magnum revolver. He returns and he goes back and he shoots Kermit in the head. He kind of slumps over and then he goes over to his mother and he shoots her once, and then before he shoots her the second time, she says to him, "Why?" And the last words he ever spoke to her were, "Because you're cruel." That attack lasted around 5 minutes. That was nothing like the end that was planned, you know. Jacob Ind wanted them dead quickly. He wasn't planning some kind of gruesome, brutal, horrific, sustained attack. He wanted it stopped. He wanted them stopped. And I'm drawing your attention to that because you know in my videos, very often we'll talk about brutal killings. We'll talk about people so full of rage and anger that they actually want to execute the person. They want to completely transform the person's body by just decimating it with a knife or shooting it many times or disemboweling it. There's almost like this desire to just take out every single moment of pain on that person because you feel so angry with the way they treated you or from what they've taken from you. Or of course, you're a serial killer and you enjoy it. Jacob Ind doesn't want that. Nothing about his demeanour says that. He just wants it done. And the reason that I'm building this up in this moment in time is because I want you to ask the question, why did this quiet, introverted 15-year-old do this? First of all, as I mentioned before, he'd been contemplating killing his parents for about 2 or 3 years. So this was not just an instantaneous moment of, I've had a bad day, I want my mate to kill my parents, which understandably would be a bizarre, terrifying and completely out of the blue idea, which would show some kind of chaos, right? Maybe some real mental decline. But it wasn't like that for Jacob. He'd been ruminating on this for a long time. Why? Because for years and years, he had been being abused. Jacob Ind said that he had been abused physically, verbally, and emotionally, and that was an everyday occurrence in the household. And Jacob Ind's brother, who's 4 years older than him, he verified that. Now I want you to think about that for a moment. If somebody had killed your parents in such a brutal fashion, premeditated, and they'd got involved in it, and you were the sibling, how would you feel? Because I know that if my brother or sister had done that to my parents, even on a bad day, and I've had bad times with my parents, you know, if they had done that, I don't think I could ever have forgiven them. And I'm not sure whether I'd ever have seen them again. But I certainly wouldn't have sat in court and defended them unless there was a serious reason why. Charles Ind sat in court and he defended his brother. But he didn't just reveal that he was emotionally and physically abused by his parents. He said that both he and Jacob were horrifically molested, that the sexual abuse was enormous, consistent, sustained, daily. Imagine being a child, being constantly raped, physically abused, beaten, and emotionally abused. And witnesses said that this emotional abuse from his mother as well began from pretty much the moment he was born. One of the relatives in court testified that she followed her mother into the room of Jacob when he was 9 months old, and she hadn't realised that she followed it in, and she watched Jacob's mother pick him up and say, "I hate you. I wish you were dead. I wish I'd never had you." Essentially, it seems that Jacob's parents had had Jacob because they were having problems in their relationship and they wanted to try to cement it, and it didn't work. And instead, she had this horrible resentment for a child that represented the failure of her relationship and the fact that now she was even further tied to somebody that she didn't love. The relatives also said that one of the things that was very present in the Ind household was the fact that both boys seemed to have a very unusual knowledge of sex from a really young age. When I worked with social services and for the local authority, one of the things that we would look at, and this is very common when I went and did house assessments to see how children were managing, if a child was overly friendly, you might find that quite strange, that over friendliness is something that is a red flag for us. But let's say I walked into a stranger's house to do an assessment on the way that the family was parenting, and a girl would run over and sit on my knee and put her arms around me, and believe me, that happened on many occasions. I did not think, what a friendly child. I thought, these boundaries are scary. Because if a child will trust a stranger and throw their arms around you in that way and sit on your lap, that is not normal behaviour. It means that they are used to strangers being physically around them in a way that only their intimate peers should be, such as siblings and parents. So the fact that these boys knew things about sex from an early age, again, that would be a red flag. We would be very concerned about that. Children should not know about sex from a young age. Yes, we educate them. Of course, I talk to my own children about sex, about porn, about consent, pretty much from the get-go. But they didn't understand the actual action and they weren't sexually aware in that way, because children aren't unless they're being exposed to it. I also want to bring to your attention that none of those relatives were called to give evidence at the trial. I feel angry when I think about this case. None of the relatives who could come in and confirm that actually these children knew too much, were over-sexualised, were called. I have no idea what the defence were doing, because they should have been on that stand. Charles Ind really regrets the fact that he moved out. So Jacob's older brother decided that he had to look after himself, and the moment that he could get out, he got out. He didn't want to be there alone. And obviously the problem remains that when he left, that meant that Jacob Ind was on his own. That meant that the people who were harming him or were using him to express their discontent about life or the way that they felt about a bad day or indeed their sexual predilections only had access to him. Also, the fact that Jacob's mother and father were divorced when Jacob was 3 meant that he didn't have his father around to protect him. And Commode had actually arrived in the boy's life 3 years later. So it was when Jacob was 4 that he arrived in his life. He was also 16 years older than Pamela, Jacob's mother. From the get-go, he was not the best choice in partner. Gonna be honest. I know people have problems with alcohol. I have people in my life who've got alcohol problems. They're really nice. They're not violent. They're not child molesters. But it's not kind of helpful, is it, to have an alcoholic around young kids? And from the get-go, he was a heavy drinker, had a massively violent past with relationships. Not the kind of person you bring into your kids' lives. And I'm sorry to sound judgmental, but it also had 4 failed marriages, so hardly the consistent kind of guy. You know what? I know that some people struggle with relationships. I know that some of us will have had more than one marriage. I can put my hand up, I have. But 4 failed marriages, violent past, heavy drinker. Not the best choice. Also, he was known, according to some, as a serial paedophile. They're known as a pederast. So he wasn't just somebody who'd molested on one occasion. He was prolific. He also went for women who had young sons. So he sounds like just the dreamboat, doesn't he? We'd like to see his Tinder profile, a bit of a predilection for children and violence and a bit of drinking as well. But nonetheless, this is what people like him do. They find opportunities to get into people's lives, usually vulnerable people, who they can then manipulate so they have access to their children. One of the things that Charles said, which is Jacob's brother, is that one of the regular events that would occur was that Commode would actually grab them, throw them into the bathroom, and he said it was physical. He would physically throw them. Remember, these are children, these are young people. And when abuse starts, you have to remember this, they are young. And even when you grow and you become more physically capable, you are that child in that moment that was first thrown into that bathroom. You never become that person that can deal with the abuser because you are caught in child state. That person is always huge to you. They are the monster, the aggressor, the abuser. So even when you become physically more able to challenge that person, you don't psychologically have the tools. That's why there's so much shame felt with abuse victims. They feel that at some point they should have said no. At some point they should have fought back. At some point they should have been able to stop that person from hurting them. But they're always the child. They're always in terror. And when he threw them in the bathroom, he then violently hit them with belts. He'd tie them to the toilet with ropes. All under the nose of their mother. The other thing that he liked to do was give the boys long bath sessions. They started really early on in the relationship. Of course they did, because I suppose when Pamela first brought him in, she wasn't imagining that he was some kind of prolific paedophile, and every step-parent wants to ingratiate themselves to their partner, and one of the ways that you do that is to make it damn sure that you care for the kids. So even in Pamela's small defence at this moment in time, him giving the kids baths, she would probably have kind of thought that was a good thing. He was getting engaged, he was playing a dad. Pamela would also be at work a lot of the time, so it meant that he had access to the children alone. It started from the get-go. He'd fondle them, he'd masturbate against them, and he'd rape them at times. Children. And the way that he managed this was, he said, if you tell anyone, I'm going to kill you. Children who are told that believe it. I cannot express to you the compassion I feel for these boys. I know we are talking about a really serious offence, but I want you to think about those children. I want you to be in that situation where you have this adult enter your world, and this adult doesn't just abuse you, they threaten your life on a daily basis. I want you to imagine what it would be like growing up. And everybody who knew them said they knew their P's and Q's, they knew their pleases and thank yous, they were so well behaved, and you absolutely bet damn straight they did, because they were under threat of death on a daily basis. And if your caregivers, your primary caregivers, can speak to you that way, can threaten you that way, then you believe it's possible, because they're meant to be the people protecting you. How conflicted are you in these cases? How conflicted are you when the very people who are meant to love you more than anything can rape you, neglect you, abuse you, emotionally threaten you, and tell you worse than that? If you dare to utter a word of it, they'll kill you. Charles also said his mum knew about it. And the reason I'm bringing Charles Ind into this is because he showed such bravery. He'd never talked about the domestic abuse. He'd never talked about the sexual abuse. He did it on the stand because he wanted to save his brother, because he knew the pain that his brother was going through. He knew the actions that led to that moment. And he even said, my mother knew. Even more so, when his grandmother was interviewed, she said that she found it very strange the way that Kermit would actually be around Jacob, because he'd sit him on his lap and he'd stroke him all over. She even said that when he did it, and this is from the words of her mouth, Kermit would get sexually aroused and he'd have to excuse himself. Imagine viewing that. Now I know all of you are sitting at home going, what the fuck? How did that not get dealt with? I get it. But believe me, when this happened, the 80s and 90s even, and certainly the 70s, were absolutely rife with children getting abused who didn't have a voice. It just wasn't talked about. People didn't deal with it. Even family didn't deal with it. Behaviours were gotten away with that should never have gotten away with. And remember, families struggle to deal with family issues because of the fact that it causes conflict. But these things were being seen. It's also now been said that Jacob was also molested by his mother. From the ages of 6 to 12, she used to make him give her oral sex. Abusing a child is always horrific. Men abusing children is far more common, and I'm sorry that I find it difficult to describe when a woman does it, but I am a mother. I cannot comprehend a mother sexually abusing her child. It goes against every inch of my nature, and I'm sure that every single one of you at home now is struggling with that. Pamela made him give her oral sex between the ages of 6 and 12. He was an infant. A friend of Pamela's also said on reflection that one of the things she found really strange about Pamela was that she would almost fondle the boy's genitals when she was cleaning them. And it's also worth mentioning that that very friend who found that behaviour really strange also had her son come to her and say that Pamela had also groped him. So I'm sorry, it's very easy, isn't it, for somebody to sit and tell a story. And Jacob Ind could be somebody who just wants to seem innocent, couldn't he? He could, you know, we've seen it. My God, Casey Anthony, for one, let's just use the sexual abuse case to throw it into disarray and make out that I'm the victim. I get it. But no. Charles Ind, his brother, who should by all intents and purposes have been distraught and devastated that his parents had been murdered, albeit that one was a step-parent, he's saying that Jacob Ind reacted because of sexual and physical abuse. And one of Pamela's own friends and son is saying it, and his grandmother is saying it. There is no doubt in my mind this boy was horribly abused. Jacob also said one of the biggest struggles that he had was his mother just used to tell him that she hated him. Imagine that. Some of you might have gone through that. I know a lot of you who watch crime have been through similar situations. I know some of you will have had those words uttered to you, and I'll know the impact. To hear your parents say those words, even in the heat of the moment, is soul destroying. But for him, it was daily. She used to make fun of him. She used to belittle him. And you know what? On reflection, all he ever wanted was to make her love him. He would do anything to try to get her to understand that he was enough. So he spent his time trying to be a good boy. And when Charles Ind talks about this, he said that until their parents would come in at night or in the evening or when the door would go, there would be these moments where him and Jacob just felt really relaxed and really content and really at peace because nobody could hurt them. And that in those moments, there would just be these periods where just being with each other and not having the worry of what was going to occur, just allowing themselves to just enjoy the quiet, to enjoy what they were watching on television, to not have to think about what was going to come next. But the moment they heard the click of the door, all they felt was panic, because they knew that they might get beaten, they might get sexually abused, they might get humiliated. There was always going to be potential. They were on high alert all the time. That is what these children had to deal with every single day of the week. It was also well known by people who knew Pamela and Kermit that they were very, very controlling. And it wasn't controlling her, can you get in for 11 o'clock in the evening or there'll be a grounding? Or can you make sure that you've got your homework done? You know, we all have levels of control in our life, don't we, with our kids? Although sometimes I do think I should probably give my kids more control. I'm a bit of a liberal parent. They'll probably be like that in about 30 years. Mum, I really think you were a bit too liberal with us, but whatever, it's worked. We don't argue. We have a really nice life together, but I guess I'll have screwed them up in some way. Parents all screw their kids up a little bit, don't they? Even when we think we're not doing. But, you know, most of us have got levels and boundaries that we would expect our children to aspire to attain. Not the case in the Ind household. Pamela and Commode, they controlled everything. What he ate, when he brushed his teeth, how he decorated his room, where he went, where he didn't go. And this was really, really exacerbated by the fact that Pamela kind of, in my opinion, had a mental health issue with OCD. She was massively obsessed with cleanliness. So everything had to be a certain way. That is not conducive to childhood. It's not conducive to children. Children are messy. Believe me, my children still think that the wardrobe is on the floor and that the magic cleaning fairy runs in on a daily basis and just picks it up and puts it in the right places. And the same with the magic pot washer. Just they disappear whilst they're growing some penicillin on mugs that they've left in their room for a month and we haven't managed to find. But then in the end, it will just come back clean. I get it. Kids can be messy, but also a home is meant to be, isn't it? Isn't a home meant to be when you've got kids? Isn't there meant to be chaos? Aren't children meant to be allowed to be a little bit free? And when you haven't got that in a household, it's worrying. You know what I said earlier on about when we go and do assessments in houses? One of the things that we look for are things like kids' toys. Are these children allowed to be children? When I've talked in a previous video about the Harts family, when they killed their children, one of the notes that was made was the fact that the house had no toys in it. That is not what we'd expect with 6 children. So these are indicators that something isn't right. Pamela's own sister would even say that there were really strange family dynamics. Again, she never gave evidence at the trial. What was going on in this trial? What was going on in this trial? I will talk about my thoughts about that later on, but I feel this anger when I'm talking about this. I feel this anger when I'm talking about this. And what she actually said, what her sister said was, their home was the only place I've ever been where I felt there was a real presence of evil. I felt a real presence of evil. She also said that Pamela and Commode showed absolutely no love for each other. All they seemed to do was spend time punishing the boys. It was just constant. They kind of took out all their frustrations, all their hostilities, all their aggression in the direction of their children. And Pamela was known to be highly verbally abusive and highly demeaning to her children. There was no reasoning with her. People would actually say to her, you know, this is not an acceptable way to treat your kids, and she did not care. All she cared about was using her children as a punching bag. And as I said earlier on, we have an alcoholic problem here because Commode was very, very, very alcoholic. So he was constantly drinking heavily. And what does that do? We all know what that does. It lowers inhibitions and it makes you act in ways that if you already have a predisposition to act, you're going to exacerbate that behaviour. I also want to bring it in. He used to collect books on torture. On torture. He was also one who used to like propositioning a few people, including Pamela's sister. So he seems like the perfect kind of partner, doesn't he? Could she have selected anyone better for herself? But nonetheless, sarcasm aside, she was a child molester as well. So I guess if you have got these bizarre and completely outrageous predilections, then you're going to want to find a partner in crime, aren't you? You're going to want to be able to normalise it. Jacob said in court, I didn't have any other choice. I didn't see that there was any other way of getting away from this. I felt that I needed to become a parent. And he said, quote, I knew my parents weren't stupid enough to kill me, but I was in a situation where I felt that if I didn't do that, I was going to die. Not by their hands, but by my own, because I didn't feel I had any other option. Think about that 15-year-old boy. Think about that little boy molested, raped, sexually abused by his mother and stepfather. And imagine thinking that the only way at that 15-year-old's opportunity was to kill himself. Imagine that being the only thinking that you had. But not actually being suicidal. Because remember, that's what he's saying in that situation. He's saying, I thought this was the only way because otherwise it was going to be about me killing myself. So essentially, yes, I agree, he chose himself. But he chose himself in my belief system because with that blinkered thinking at 15, he really didn't think that there were any other options. I've listened, and again, please understand there is bias. Go and do your research. Go and watch some of the interviews. Listen to this man. Because he clearly is able to recognise that when he was 15, he didn't think it through at all. He had absolutely no idea of the consequences of his actions. In fact, I'll bring in some of the stuff that he talks about in his interviews. And he said when he was arrested, bear in mind, he's killed his parents. He's been involved in the murder of his own parents. And yet, in the police station, he's talking to his brother and he's saying, I've got an eighth of weed in my bedroom. Make sure you hide it from the police because I don't want to get into trouble for that. Get my homework from school. The consequential thinking wasn't there. He'd just murdered his parents and he's worried that the police might get him in trouble for a bit of weed. He's not had the reality of the gravity of what police, detectives, investigators and the jurisdiction would say is premeditated first-degree murder. And that's because he genuinely didn't think it was wrong. He just wanted them out of his life. He thought he could kill his parents and his life would be okay. And he said, bink, they're gone. Just like hitting the delete button on a computer or something, like taking an eraser and rubbing them out. The naivety there is huge, isn't it? And as I said, the fact that he was asking his brother to hide things from the police because he genuinely didn't think that he was going to get into trouble. I know what he did was wrong, by the way, guys. There is no reason to kill anybody. I understand. But I think we have to also acknowledge the turbulent issues that brought him to this moment, right? I also don't want to make out that Jacob Ind was a complete saint. Because at his middle school, for example, a teacher said that there would be moments where he would hurt other kids for no reason. For example, on one occasion, he noticed a boy had his head in his locker looking for something, and he kicked the door shut on his head. Not okay. Didn't even know the boy. Just saw an opportunity to hurt him. So that's not acceptable behaviour, right? That is not acceptable behaviour. But you put yourself in a position where you have no control in your life. You put yourself in a position where you have this feeling of sadness and rage and loss and a lack of control and an understanding that it's okay to hurt people because you know you get hurt every single day. And just this opportunity where you can do the same to someone else. That's not okay. It's callous and it's brutal and it's inexcusable. But I want you to understand the psychology behind that kind of an action. Because I think when you look at his life, that behaviour isn't that surprising. When it goes to trial, the 12th of May 1994, both Jacob Ind and Gabriel Adams are tried separately. And they decide to try Jacob Ind as an adult. At this moment in time, taking you back to what I said earlier on, there is this fever about young people. In this state, originally they had quite lenient rules. They believed that children had a right to change. They believed that you could make mistakes and those mistakes could be rectified, and that juvenile crime was distinct from adult crime. We know now why, because of the developing brain. We know now because children don't think in the same way as adults think. That isn't to say for 1 minute that some children deserve to ever walk the streets again. Some children actually will pose a risk even when they're an adult and they've had all the help in the world. So we do know that full life tariffs, for example, can make sense at times. But this particular state had a leniency up until this particular time. And it seemed that with the gangbanging and with random crimes occurring where children were involved in murder, it started to shift the way that they thought. And all of a sudden they brought back this idea that a child, a 15-year-old, can be tried as an adult. He wasn't to give evidence at his trial. I think that was a terrible idea. In fact, what makes it even more terrible is that Jacob Ind wanted to give evidence. And you know what happened to him? His defence team said that they'd abandoned the case. And it terrified him. Of course it did. He was already on his own. He was terrified. He was a kid, a horribly abused, broken child. And instead of being allowed to take that stand and tell the truth, his truth, instead of allowing the jury to be able to watch a child in pain express what it is like to be an individual who has been sodomized, humiliated, threatened, beaten. Instead of allowing him to have that moment, they said no. So he didn't even get to stand in his own truth. And he didn't sack them and get a new team because he was too immature to do that. How the hell would you know how to do that? Basically, his attorney, Sean Kaufman, believed that he would have made a bad impression on the jury. If you listen to him in interviews, I don't think he would have. They suggested that he was flat and unemotional and would have shown no remorse for the killings. I think he was a traumatised young man who would have struggled greatly, but had the potential to express and explain the reasoning behind his thought process. He never got that opportunity. And I think that the fact that they also didn't bring into evidence all these people who would have validated and verified the fact that he was a traumatised young man would have made a massive difference. But no, they just let him stay silent. He tried to plead self-defence, of course he did, because he was defending himself from abuse. He'd had years of being told he was going to be murdered. He was years of being told that if he said anything, he'd be killed. His brother took the stand and said all of that. But because he couldn't prove in that situation when he killed his parents that he was in imminent danger of harm, they said it didn't count. So it would have been different if he had taken that gun when his stepfather was abusing him and he'd blown his brain out. That would have been self-defence. But because he, to some degree, had premeditated it. Secondly, when he found his parents had been shot, he didn't ring the ambulance. He actually went on to further kill them. He was not defending himself. Isn't it interesting how rule of law can work? So all of those years of abuse, all of that horrific torture, all of the fears for his life, they meant nothing. Imagine being scared for your life every single day of the week. So one day you decide that the people who are going to kill you, you're going to kill first, but that doesn't count. Because that's what we're saying. We're saying that he doesn't get to defend himself because he wasn't being raped in that moment. There are some interesting cases in the UK where abusers have been killed by the person they abused, and those individuals have not been sent to prison. Why? Because they were defending themselves, albeit in the future, from something that happened in the past. And I think that's a really good thing. I don't think it's good that they killed them. That's terrible. But I do think it's good that they didn't go to prison for it, because they were acting from a place of trauma. There was so much in the press about this. They painted Jacob Ind as a horrible, terrible human being who was a bloodlust killer. Somebody who was a psychopath. Somebody who wanted his parents dead. Somebody who was selfish. Because it was premeditated, because they planned the murders with a friend, they almost tried to bring it into that situation where they were two unhinged teenagers who just wanted to do what they wanted with the parents. When the jury retired to deliberate over the verdict, it took them 5 days, and it's not surprising because I bet there was someone like me there. I bet there was someone just like me who just fought and fought and fought because they did not believe this boy, or in fact, both of these boys to some degree, deserved to be treated as adults or to face the sentence they would face. I would have been that person. They wouldn't have got out for 6 or 7 weeks because I'd have been there till I convinced every single one of them they were going nowhere unless we allowed people to understand that this child was a victim of abuse. But it took them 5 days. And they were found guilty. They were given 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. 15, traumatised, abused, so many years of their lives. And of course, Gabriel Adams didn't need to do what he did. Serious mental health issues, probably a lot more dangerous than Jacob Ind, got to be honest with you, and in desperate need of help, but likely in need of mental health help, not a life imprisonment sentence. They were also sent to maximum security Colorado State Penitentiary. Imagine that, you're a middle-class boy. You've never said boo to a goose, really. You've always done quite well at school. You've not ever really been involved in any violent crime. And you're suddenly having to fend for yourself at Colorado State Penitentiary, dealing with the horrible abuse that you've suffered. One of the jurors, on reflection, said she didn't really understand when they went forward with the sentencing the implications of a first-degree murder conviction. She didn't realise it was an automatic life sentence without parole. And I'll tell you why. The judge had indicated that he would be sent to a therapeutic environment. Oh, it makes me so angry. So the judge, when he'd summed up before they retired, suggested that what they would do was they'd put him in a therapeutic environment. So the people who made the decision on that jury believed that Jacob Ind might get help, and God, he needed it. But he didn't. They just sent him to a high security adult prison. Also, it's worth knowing that from 1995 onwards, most of his time was in solitary confinement. And the reason for this solitary confinement is when they searched his cell, and we all know, we've seen it on movies, haven't we? They go and have a look at people's cells and check for contraband. They found a braided rope and a sharpened 7-inch piece of rebar, which is a reinforced steel. Now, he said he was using that rope for washing line, and he said that he needed the rebar for protection. I'm not bloody surprised. I'd have wanted to create a few of my own shanks if I was in an adult high security jail, surrounded by people who are really freaking scary, and I'm a 15-year-old boy, a good-looking young lad. What are you going to be wanting to do? And because of that, he was put in solitary, an 8-foot by 10-foot cell. That kid spent an average of 23 hours a day in there. It offends me on every level. It's worth noting that during the time that Jacob Ind was in prison, he completed a paralegal certificate and he did a PhD in theology. He worked really hard. And what does that say to you? What does that say to you about a 15-year-old boy growing into a man, doing a PhD? And PhDs are bloody hard work. And I know you've got time in prison. But one, it demonstrates commitment. Secondly, it shows change and growth. And most importantly, it suggests the potential of being able to give something back to society. Now, I'm going to be really honest. What heartens me about this case is that massive amounts of support has occurred for his release. And one of the big things that really helped this was in 2012, there was a decision called Miller versus Alabama. And that was when they looked at the fact that they considered that life sentences of juveniles are unconstitutional. Now, you may feel differently, and it's okay if you do. Remember, I'm saying this in this case. I don't think that all juveniles deserve to have their sentences revoked or changed or looked at. Some will definitely be a danger to society. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be allowed to have cases looked at, because unless we do that, it means that we can't look at anybody's case. In October 2017, Jacob Ind successfully appealed his conviction. It was set aside. The day after that, Kaufman, his original attorney, had his licence suspended. And I'll tell you why. Because he had not adequately represented his client. And it wasn't just Jacob Ind who suffered, it was others. But because of this case, that man was not allowed to represent others, thank God. Because I'm not qualified in law, but let me tell you, I would have got that boy off. I'm not saying I wouldn't have had him sent to prison. I'm not saying that Jacob Ind would have walked free. I'm saying he would have got a far lesser sentence. By this point, Jacob Ind had been in prison for 25 years. 25 years. And the court ruled that he was denied his constitutional rights and not being allowed to testify in his own defence, and rightly so. He was desperate to talk about how his mother had been with him. He said she knew exactly what to say to rip your heart out. She was an expert in it. She'd have made a great lawyer. Also, when they've spoken to jurors who were on that particular panel, they said, with respect, if we'd heard him speak, after hearing the way that he does speak, we would have given a completely different verdict. Now, Jacob Ind didn't want to go through a retrial, so the prosecution offered him a plea bargain. Jacob Ind ultimately pleaded guilty to a second-degree murder, and he was resentenced to 60 years in prison. I know, just go with me on this though. I know it's terrible, right? It's awful. 60 years in prison is horrific. However, he was released in 2020. He served 27 years, 2/3 of his life behind bars. But the point is, because he had good behaviour, because of his PhD, because he'd never, ever done anything wrong in prison, and because he'd already served such a large part of his sentence, he was allowed to walk free. Currently, he lives alone in Denver, but soon he hopes to live with his wife, Denise Salford. And they are hoping that they're going to move to Northern Ireland. That's where she lives. So now that he's met Denise Salford, one of the things that he wants to do is to move to Northern Ireland and to start life again. That is hard because basically he has killed people and it's pretty difficult to move to another country when you've done that. Equally, she can only come to the States for 90 days at a time. I would also imagine that because of COVID, they won't have seen each other. I know that I have painted Jacob Ind in a really positive way through this video. That is because what I want to talk about is the impact of trauma and the lack of evidence that was brought in to the court case. However, I'm also going to make it clear he isn't perfect, because one of the bits of my research that I really struggle with is that even though he did a PhD in theology, which should help him to understand the importance of religion and hopefully the positivity, particularly of the New Testament, nonetheless, he's been involved in the Christian identity movement. And that, in my opinion, is basically a religious movement for racist idiots and bigots. That's my view. I'm sorry if you believe in the Christian identity movement. I think it's friggin' awful. It's basically a far white supremacist organisation, and you should not be involved in anything like that. However, again, we all know that when you're in prison, there is a need to belong to certain people, and very often people become gang affiliated, and it feels like that was what happened when he was in prison. He kind of joined the white supremacist area, which is a way that he survived. Still, not okay. Leave it behind, Jacob. Makes you a bit of a twat, in my opinion. Let me just tell you a little bit about this belief system. It believes that Jesus descended from white Europeans and all non-white Europeans will one day be exterminated or enslaved in the new kingdom of heaven on earth, which is a little bit of a problem based in mind that the fact that Jesus wasn't white-skinned, but never mind. That part of me is angry with him, and I'm honestly not trying to deny any of the things I've said. You've heard how passionate I am about young people having a right at times to be heard when they've been abused. But it does seem a shame that he's decided to devote his energy to what I consider as a pile of nonsense. And that also says to me that some of his psychological issues haven't been addressed in prison, because you should come out of prison understanding that that kind of racism and supremacy is a very bad mindset. If you've ever watched American History X, which is beautifully played by Edward Norton, that's a really interesting film where he goes to prison and he is a white supremacist and he comes out understanding after being protected by a black man how screwed up his viewpoints are. But in this case, it seems that Jacob Ind hasn't gone through that process. He also said that he's never had any psychiatric treatment since he killed his parents, but he has been told by the people who are meant to be in the know psychiatrically and psychologically who deal with him that he's considered completely normal. I'll give him that, apart from the white supremacy bit. I feel like I might have tainted all of your opinions now, and you'll be like, oh, bloody hell, Emma, I was really on his side, but now you've told me he's a white sodding supremacist. But I never want to not bring balance. Jacob Ind isn't perfect, but that doesn't mean that he deserved to spend his entire life in prison. He was horrifically abused. He was a child who was horrifically abused. And who knows what he had to do to survive that environment? Who knows who he had to be friends with and who he had to be an ally of to survive? I think we have to ask our questions, don't we? Could it have been avoided in the first place? Lots of teachers knew that some kind of physical abuse was happening at home. Nothing was done. He told school counsellors he wanted to harm his parents. Those concerns were not reported to social services. In school, he was actually going around and asking other people, all the mates, could you come parents for me? I mean, come on. He's literally going from person to person saying, do you know what? I don't like my parents. Would you mind murdering them for me? Clear warning signs. And the teachers even heard about it, but they didn't do anything about it. A proper child abuse investigation could have prevented those murders per se, because his parents didn't deserve to die. But the point is that if they had just acted on that information, they could have spared those deaths. Hopefully his stepfather would have gone to prison for a long time, and his mum, but nonetheless they would have been alive. But more importantly, they would have spared Jacob Ind's quarter of a century that he lost. And in his school, it also turned out that there were peer counsellors who, basically young people who listened to other young people's problems and then report it to the teachers, didn't do it. And other students said that they found Jacob Ind and Gabriel Adams were loners. There was something not quite right about them. I understand that when you're abused, you are a loner a lot of the time. But people who knew him at school said they didn't understand why counsellors didn't pick this up. And one of the things that was very present for Jacob Ind and Gabriel Adams is they were constantly made fun of. They felt alienated and isolated. It feels really sad because there were so many alarm bells there, weren't there? Also, it seems that there was a cover-up by social services. And I'll tell you why. Because Charles Ind went, when he left home, to social services and said, you need to investigate my home. My brother isn't safe. And he was meant to make a note of it. But this particular social worker said, oh yeah, he did talk to me, but I don't remember noting that down. Why would you have been at social services then? Come on. That's just a cover-up. Apparently, social services even visited the family a few weeks before the killings, and a former employee actually claimed that the evening after his parents were murdered, they watched the caseworker shredding the documents on them. That's unbelievable. I am so pissed off with the amount of corruption that I've seen in situations like that. It happens all the time. In my area and in places like Rotherham, police and social services covered up horrendous sexual exploitation and similar things happened. Yes, it was found out in the end, but nonetheless, how can we learn if we hide? So those actions meant that that young man did not get a fair trial. One of the things that Jacob said is that after it happened, I felt remorseful, but not because they were dead, but because of the way it happened. Outside of that, I never really had any second thoughts. I always saw it as the right thing to do. I'm better off. He actually felt better off in prison than he did at home. I think it's also worth mentioning that Gabriel Adams will never get out because he killed himself. In 2014, he was detained in a psychiatric hospital and he took his own life. I kind of want to ask you guys the question, do you think that Jacob Ind's sentence was right? Should he have remained in prison for the rest of his natural life? Or do you feel that him being allowed his freedom, being allowed his reparation, being allowed his reform was the right decision? Do you think he should have been tried as an adult? Remember, there's a strong argument now that the brain doesn't fully mature until 25. So should minors face the same criminal responsibility as adults? Just a question. I'd be interested in your thoughts. Jacob Ind was 15 when he killed his parents. Would you expect a 3-year-old to behave in the same way as a 13-year-old? Also, it really seems to be inconsistency because at the same time there were other young people who did similar things and didn't receive life sentences. For example, 14-year-old John Caudle killed his abusive mother and stepfather in 2011. He was given 22 years. 17-year-old Jason Spivey, he received 48 years for the rape and murder of his grandmother in 1999. Now that was a case where there was no abuse involved. So he got that long sentence, but when they looked at his history, there was no reasoning in his history that evidence that he had some kind of reason to go ahead and do that. To be fair, adults have received miles more lenient sentences for similar crimes. Let's look at 2009, 23-year-old Jeremiah Raymond Berry killed his father who sexually abused him. He got 3 years in prison. Yeah, he got 10 years of parole, but he got 3 years in prison. It feels like Jacob Ind's downfall seemed to be a combination of these factors. First off, he didn't give any evidence, so they couldn't emotionally engage with him. Secondly, he didn't show remorse. I understand why, but he didn't, and it's important to show remorse because it shows that you can be reformed. Also, he went and recruited a friend, so he premeditated it. The final thing is, his parents were in bed when they were attacked, so they didn't have an opportunity to fight back, right? So it was, as I said earlier, almost impossible to prove that Jacob Ind was actually in a situation where he was an immediate threat. And that is how you show that you were involved in a self-defense plea. Another problem in this case is that Jacob Ind always referred to the physical, verbal and emotional abuse he suffered at his hands of his parents, but he couldn't at the time really recall much sexual abuse by his stepfather. At least he didn't mention that to psychiatrists who assessed him in court. We know it happened now. He's talked about it openly now. But let me draw your attention to the fact that boys in particular, in sex abuse cases, find it nigh on impossible to admit what's happened. So even though he had the absolute bravery and courage of his brother, even though he told his story for him, Jacob Ind didn't really disclose. He suppressed it, he denied it, he avoided it. And because of this, some people who looked at the case even felt that Charles Ind made it up. I want to scream at that. Honestly, just do one. Do one. You're telling me that your brother is going to be like, oh, I'll just lie and say that I've been sexually abused to get my brother off who's just brutally murdered my loving parents. I mean, do one. But it's easy to see when people want justice bestowed or feel that somebody is callously killed, that they want to believe that that person is making it up, because it's easier, isn't it? It's easier to imagine that you've got this sociopath or psychopath, this loner, who just decided that them and the mate wanted to go murder the parents for the thrill of it. Easier than believing that Pamela Ind forcibly made her children perform oral sex on her from the age of 6 years old. Easier, isn't it? It's easier to imagine that those boys were just brutal killers. People who think that Charles made it up also think that he was involved in the killings. So, you know, not only are you a liar about the sexual abuse when you're breaking down and are absolutely devastated, and are now a trained therapist and a really nice guy. No, really, you were part of it. No, he wasn't. Look, it's always going to be controversial, this case, and some of you might hate what I've said. Honestly, I appreciate that. Some of you may think that he got off with murder in the end. I have a bias. I try to always own it. This hasn't just been me telling a story about dates and times and what happened. This is me breathing life into every abuse case that I've ever dealt with, and the pain that I see in those children and some of the actions that lead those children to do things that they shouldn't do. I think, to own my bias, I am on the same page as people who believe that this is a young boy who has suffered a lifelong experience of physical and sexual abuse, and he snapped. And I also have to concede that there will be many who call Jacob Ind a liar, who killed in cold blood, and who spent the rest of his life creating excuses for it. They have that right, as I have my right. And only you can make your decision as to how you feel about this case. Can we all agree, though, being in some weird Christian cult thing is really not okay when it involves white supremacy? And if there's one learning lesson here, don't do that, kids. Sorry, have to say that. Racism really pisses me off. I hope you found this interesting. I know that I've been quite emotional in this, and somebody's going to probably come on and be like, oh my God, she's being so emotional. And it's like, yes, I am, because I've worked with lots of sexual abuse and I can't help it because I carry their stories with me. And you know what? I can't bear paedophilia, child molestation, child neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse. I can't stand it. I believe that parents who do that are reprehensible. And sometimes they get what's coming to them. And sometimes they get something that shouldn't have happened to them because of their behaviour, as is in this case. Let me know what you think. I love hearing your thoughts. I've got a Patreon if you fancy supporting me. If you don't, it's fine too. I'm still going to be releasing this content on a Wednesday and a Sunday. So if you can subscribe and you haven't subscribed, please do it. Get your notifications on. You get a little nudge to say I've created some content. Love you lots. Thanks for listening.